thank you very much for inviting me to talk about something I'm very passionate about, which is addressing climate change. So I've got a lot of slides, which I will go through very quickly, but I'm sure they can be made available to you afterwards if there are things you'd like to look at in more detail. I'll just try and draw out one or two key points from each one. So I chair now the Adaptation Committee of the Climate Change Committee. That's the committee that looks at how do we cope with the change that's coming. That's not to say we shouldn't go on reducing emissions, we must do both. But one of the messages I hope you'll take away is that actually, even if we meet our targets on reducing emissions, there's a lot of climate change still baked into the system. So there's a lot more adaptation we need to do, and we need to help others to do as well. So we know the climate is changing, but just to remind you how extremely it's changing, if you just look at the empirical data, the data collected over time up to now, no modelling involved in this, we're seeing in the southeast corner of the UK that maximum temperatures in the summer are going up by about 1 degree a decade. That's pretty frightening. We've already seen 40-degree sea temperatures in this country. I think by the mid-century, we could well be seeing 45-degree maximum temperatures in this country down in the southeast. And that's just extrapolating what's happened already. That doesn't require any complex climate models. The kind of heat wave summer we had in 2018 and indeed in 2022, those will be just absolutely typical summers by mid-century. And indeed, we've seen some pretty terrifying global temperature rises with the hottest last year, the hottest September on record, with temperatures going up to 1.75 degrees above the pre-industrial times. So we're already. I know it's been an El Nino year, so we have that extra boost to temperatures, but we are seeing temperatures going way above those pre-industrial temperatures, and indeed sort of hitting above the temperatures that we're aiming for in terms of the agreements at COP. So just remind ourselves of that this is the temperature increase above pre-industrial that we're seeing up to the first half of the 1900s. We saw years of hotter and colder temperatures, but since sort of relatively, the 1930s or so, global temperatures have only gone up. And indeed, last year was the hottest year on record, and they're predicting that this year will beat, this 2024 will beat that, and will globally, it may not feel like it in the UK, but globally it will probably be another record year. And of course, in September, we saw, as I say, those temperatures of almost 1.8 degrees. So the Paris Agreement was that we should try and keep temperatures by the end of the century as close to 1.5 degrees as possible, and we should keep them well below 2 degrees. So we're clearly already at those sorts of levels that we were hoping to keep below by the end of the century. And we're seeing the consequences. We are seeing more extreme climate events, and we're seeing greater extremes. And this was the flooding in Germany and Belgium in 2021 that killed 220 people. That was a weather system that was very close to us. We could imagine, should be imagining, planning for things like that happening here. 2023, we saw extreme climate events just about everywhere in the globe. And 2024 has started with plenty of its own. So we had elections in India at the beginning of 2024, in April. There were 900 million people queued in the open air to vote during a 47-degree heat wave. People will have died in those queues from those sorts of temperature conditions. We had the busiest airport in the world, Dubai. We had I should mention, that heat wave in India was made 45 times more likely by climate change. 45 times. We've got things that used to be 1 in 100-year extreme events becoming 1 in 10-year extreme events. So that kind of scale of change. The busiest airport in the world, Dubai, came to a standstill because of the heaviest rainfall they've had for 75 years, which is called flooding across the UAE. Now, some of us may think Dubai airport coming to a standstill is a good thing. From a climate perspective, it might be. But, absolutely high impact, terrible events that are happening and are going to go on happening. Because at best, if we reach net zero by 2050, then our temperatures will go on going up and down with the normal sort of climatic variations. So we have had the hottest 10 years on record. Between now and 2050, every decade is going to be remembered as the hottest 10 years on record. And if we're lucky, it then stabilizes if we hit. If we're not lucky and we don't, then it goes on, average temperatures go on going up. So how are we doing? Well, globally, if we go on as we are now, business as usual, our emissions go on like that. This is where we need to get down to net zero. These are the policies that, as best they can be assessed, that countries have in place globally, will get us to there. And these are the commitments they have under the COP process. So their policies don't yet meet their commitments, and their commitments don't yet get us much more than halfway to where we need to be by 2050. So we need a lot more global action, but it isn't all bad news. So the International Energy Agency tell us that next year, renewables will be 35% of electricity generation globally more than coal, and half of the additional demand between this year and next will come from solar alone. So way more than half of the extra demand is now coming from zero carbon sources. And as I say, half of it just from solar, a really important technology in terms of the really low cost reduction of emissions from energy. How are we doing in the UK? This is the tracking that the Climate Change Committee published in July this year. And we're doing well on electricity generation. This is electricity generation. It's now right down to here. The last coal-fired power station, I think, came off the system in September. So we're doing fine on electricity generation. But some of the other big areas like transport, this purplish-coloured little bluey line, and heat in buildings are not starting to turn down towards zero anything like fast enough. So we've got a lot still to do. And if you look back from when the Climate Change Act was passed in 2008 to the third carbon budget, the first three carbon budgets were legislated in 2008. If we look back, this is where the reductions have come from. Electricity, generation reductions, industry reductions. What's the next one? Transport reductions, reductions from waste, reductions from buildings, and reductions from farming. And if we just look for the other legislated carbon budgets we've got, which take us out to 2034, which is the carbon budget 6. So we're expecting much less, as you might imagine, from electricity generation. We've done quite a lot of that. Industry, a similar kind of level of reduction still needed. A huge increase from transport, something like a factor of 2 more, and buildings, something like a factor of 4 more. Big increase in reductions from farming. And we're going to need, if we're going to get to our 6th carbon budget, the Climate Change Committee predict we're going to need engineered removals, removing CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it to become part of the story, or we're not going to meet the budget. So big scale up of activity, particularly in areas like transport and buildings and farming and engineered removals. So there are lots of challenges and opportunities that come with this. So I think it's always important that you give people a feeling that there's something positive comes out of taking action. It's not all gloom. So the Climate Change Committee looks at where do these reductions come from, and it's sort of categorized them in terms of getting to net zero in the UK in 2050 from where we are now. So these first purplish categories are about using less, becoming more efficient, reducing demand. Now, of course, if we could make this category bigger, that's the absolutely cheapest way and least damaging to the planet way of reducing our emissions. But that's hugely dependent on people's behavior. So that's probably a fairly cautious assessment of how much we can get from that. This is about take-up of new technologies, particularly electrification, This blue piece is about electrification or expanding the low-carbon energy system. And this green piece is called offsetting emissions. So that's both nature-based solutions like planting more trees and restoring peat and wetlands, but it's also likely now to be engineered removals and storage of the CO2. So those are the areas where reductions are going to come from. And again, a positive message. We've got lots of UK companies, some big traditional UK companies, the rest of these actually UK startup companies that are working in those areas and starting really to make a difference. And we're starting to see that impact on the economy. So the assessment is that last year, the green economy in the UK grew by 9%, while the rest of the economy barely grew at all. And we are now the 8th largest exporter of green products in the UK. And that's now way ahead of where we are in terms of as a manufacturing exporter. So that we're going up the list of in the league table of exporters of green products. And we're really starting to grow a fast-growing economy. And some of these sorts of companies, hopefully in the future, will be very much part of that. So again, there's opportunity here that we need to drive, which is also delivering some of the changes that we so desperately need. It's also getting tougher in some ways, that up to now, about 83% of the emissions reductions we've achieved have come from things that people didn't have to engage with at all. They've come from reducing the emissions from our electricity system. It doesn't make any difference to us. We still plug things in, it still works the same. And about 16 or 17% has come from things where we actually had to do something different in our lives, make a different choice, buy a different car. So most of the emissions reductions we've been pleased to see, but they haven't affected us in any way. So it's been easy for us. As we go forward to 2050, about 40% of the emissions reductions still come from electricity and from manufacturing. Again, most of us won't notice those happening. But now 60% or so of the emissions reductions are going to require us to change our behaviors in some way. So there's a huge need to get people much, much more engaged, not just in worrying about climate change, but doing something about climate change. And there's another message which is both positive and negative, which is we need to grow investment in the UK in decarbonising our economy, and we need to grow it very fast. There will be a benefit from that. There's a benefit in terms of operating cost reduction. There's a benefit in reducing imports, because wind is free for powering our electricity system, but oil and gas we typically import and have to pay for. So there are benefits, but the investment comes a long time before the reductions in operating costs. And the investment and the benefits are not spread evenly. So most of the investment comes in the electricity system, for example. Most of the benefits come from reducing the cost of transport by making it much more efficient through electrification. So of course we need a tax system that redistributes the benefits in order to enable us to pay for the investments that we need to make. Those investments, of course, they're not all government investments. They're investments from companies like Ørsted, which I'm a non-executive on the board of. And when I was working with the government on developing the offshore wind sector deal back in 2019, 2020, one of the things we looked at was, in those days we had a target of 30 megawatts of offshore wind by 2030. We now have a target of 50 to 55 megawatts, but even when we had a target of 30 megawatts of offshore wind by 2030, the prediction was that would generate 27,000 skilled jobs. And the importance of those skilled jobs from this industry is that they come all round the UK's coastline, not round the southeast or the Golden Triangle, in Wales, in Scotland, in places where we need good quality, high-paid jobs, and in places where they can make a real difference to the economy of these regions. So if we do this transition thoughtfully and with the right policy in place, there's a lot of benefit we can deliver. And I think the most impressive thing for me is that the developments in Hull and Grimsby, with the Siemens blade factory in Hull and the Ørsted control centre for all of its North Sea wind on the old Grimsby fish docks, the impact of developments like that have reduced male unemployment in Hull by 50%. So if we get this right, there will be all sorts of benefits we can deliver. And I need to speed up because I've got 10 minutes left. But I think you've got the message. We need to get to net zero, but getting to net zero alone is not enough. We're still going to have to adapt quite a lot. And we need to avoid maladaptation by putting our Tesla charging stations somewhere where it doesn't flood, preferably. But so by mid-century, we're going to get, in the UK, another 0.5 degree of average temperature rise. That means that a heat wave summer like 2018 will be a perfectly normal summer, and heat wave summers will be something much more frightening than that. We could get up to 24% less summer rainfall, and that will particularly affect areas like the Fens and the southeast, where we grow a lot of food. We could get up to 16% more winter rainfall, so much more flooding, and also we might stop farmers from planting. Their fields are waterlogged, so drought in the summer and waterlogged fields in the winter. Much more of that rain will come as short, sharp, almost tropical rainstorms that cause surface water flooding. And of course, the sea level will continue to rise. So in those hot periods in the summer, this is data from 2021, I think, just showing the peaks we get in death rates. So excess deaths just in England alone, well over 3,000 in those peaks during that heat wave summer. We'll get more water shortages. This is a prediction of that's water availability pretty much today. By mid-century, if we don't do more adaptation, we'll be seeing in these farming regions, they'll be getting short of water, and really short of water, obviously, around London and some of the areas around the centre of the country, and much worse if we are on a 4-degree trajectory. Continuing increase in wildfires, not something we think a lot about the UK, but they're becoming already an increasing problem. New pests and diseases coming as it gets warmer. This is an example of how rapidly needle blight has spread in the forestry estate in Scotland. But of course, we're getting the spread of tick-borne diseases. We're going to get the spread of mosquito-borne diseases, things that affect people as well as our plants and our animals. Flooding is going to increase even with the investment the Environment Agency is able to make. So more people will be affected by flooding homes. And almost all of these things disproportionately affect poor people, elderly people, people who are ill. And if you just think of our coastal communities, many of them are communities of older people and not in good health. They tend to be areas of low income and indeed high unemployment or very seasonal employment. That means these people are more vulnerable to problems. They're also less likely to be insured. And of course, being on the coast, they are at greater exposure to climate risk. So when a climate hazard like flooding occurs, their losses are disproportionate, because if you've got an uninsured home, or if you're poorly paid and you have to take more time off work, all of these things compound, and we know there's now increasing amounts of data that show that the people who are less well off and suffer more damage from flooding show increased levels of illness, particularly increased levels of mental illness. So I think in the 2007 floods, one of the studies showed that the low-income groups are 8 times more likely to have mental health problems than high-income groups. So it's not just the global north and the global south, and the global south is more affected. This is on our own doorstep, and inequality is exacerbated by what climate change is bringing. Again, there's some good news. Where we have data, and we don't have enough data, we know that addressing climate change is cost effective. So 10-to-1 benefits for some water efficiency measures but many things at least 2-to-1 benefits. So lots of areas where we know it is beneficial to address adaptation, but unfortunately there are lots of reasons why people don't invest in it. There are a lot of barriers to investment. One of those barriers is that the benefits are often widely distributed, so it's quite hard to see where your income for that on investment is going to come from. Some of it's just low awareness. Some of it's that we don't have the right policy and regulation in place, so we don't have the right incentives. And some of it's because people think the government should do this. Some of it's because we don't like dealing with uncertainty. There's a probability this might happen. Oh, so it probably won't happen, you know. And of course, a lot of it is about doing things for things that might happen in the future. So there's a lot of challenges to getting investment into adaptation still, although it's starting to get a bit better. So just let me finish by saying, why is this relevant? Well, this affects absolutely all of us in everything we do, whatever it is. And of course, it particularly affects children and future generations. But it affects our health and well-being, whether that's our mental health, whether that's the tick that's going to give us Lyme disease, whether that's a mosquito that's going to be bringing something that we really don't want in this country, or whether that's just we live in a home that's overheats desperately in the summer and makes us unwell. It affects our homes, the communities we live in. Of course, we're hearing about it affecting nature all the time. On the news this morning, we had the fact that the butterfly numbers are dramatically down in the UK. It affects food supply and prices. We're going to be seeing the prices of potatoes rising in this country because of the flooding that we had over the winter and earlier this year. When they have really high temperatures and drought in Spain, the costs of our salad crops and our tomatoes go up dramatically in the supermarkets. There's an estimate that something like 40 to 60% of food inflation this year has been caused by climate change impacts. It affects our transport. It clearly has implications for what we should be teaching children in school. It can affect jobs both positively and negatively, of course. It affects the economy, and again, potentially both positively and negatively. It's absolutely all about equity and justice. And of course, it has the potential to have dramatic effects on political stability and conflict. I mean, the voting in the Indian elections, the people whose land is no longer, can no longer be farmed, and so are looking to move to other areas and come into conflict with their neighbours in parts of the global south. So it affects just about everything we could possibly do. So, and here I'm sure I'm teaching you to suck eggs, but what can you do about it? And the answer is lots. But one of the first things I would have on my list is you can help make things investable. And that, I think, is really critical, particularly on the adaptation front. If you're prepared to take the first risk in order to draw in other investors, we can speed up some of the things that we need to do. We can start thinking about how do we make those adaptation propositions investable. So if you can help make things investable, that's brilliantly beneficial. You can, of course, do all sorts of things to accelerate change. Convening, we heard about the citizens' jury recently from the Nuffield Trust on looking at whether we should have, whether people should be allowed to commit suicide if they're, or assist people to commit suicide if they're terminally ill. We need a lot more of that kind of activity on climate change and adaptation. Of course, we need more in the area of education and information. There's a great group in the House of Lords called Peers for the Planet, P4P, which is funded by a philanthropy which produces very good briefings and things for us in the House of Lords and is used very extensively. I know that Lord Sainsbury's charity is involved in climate education. That's really key. Another area is developing standards and targets. Of course, there's investing in research and innovation. In terms of developing standards and targets, the other area I would say is helping less developed countries who could be benefiting from offsetting, helping them get in place the kind of governance that enables those offsets to be robust. offsetting has got a terribly bad name, but actually the potential for developing countries to benefit from offsetting is enormous. But they need the governance and the financial standards and the monitoring in place that means a Western company can trust that that CO2 is actually being absorbed by that mangrove swamp regeneration or whatever it is. So we really do need to help countries to do those sorts of things. I went to COP26. I met some brilliant Peruvian coffee farmers who had been helped to get together and try out new coffee varieties and report to each other on what could they do, because their livelihood was totally threatened by the change in weather they were experiencing. And they had brilliant stories about the things that had worked and the things that hadn't. Clearly, plenty of areas where we need more mental health support for those affected by climate. Clearly, you will know all about, I'm sure, people affected by climate-related disasters and conflict. There are some wonderful startups who are quite high risk but could do good things if they could get going, and some wonderful social enterprises in the circular economy area who need support. Local councils know a lot about inequality and have no money at all, and most of them have quite ambitious plans. They desperately need collaboration and help, I think, in terms of the area of public-private partnerships. And of course, and I'm sure many of you do, you can set an example, and I've seen some great stuff from the National Trust about making their own operations net zero and resilient. So I'm sure much of that is stuff you already know about, but perhaps I've sparked some thoughts, and I'm sure there are lots of interesting things you're doing that should have been on that list, but aren't. But thank you very much, and I fear I may have run over by a minute or two, but I hope not too long. But thank you very much for listening.